You're watching Northern Crimes.
Winnipeg, Manitoba, a city where two rivers meet, carving pathways through the heart of the Canadian prairies. The Red River flows northward, its murky waters carrying whispers of the past. These waters have swallowed many stories, some lost forever beneath the shifting silt, never to be found. But on a warm August day in 2014, the river gave one back. A body, wrapped in plastic and weighed down with rocks, surfaced near the Alexander docks. 15-year-old Tina Fontaine. Her death would shock the nation, but for many in Winnipeg's Indigenous community, it confirmed what they'd long feared. The Red River holds dark truths, and it wasn't done revealing them. What began as grief became a movement. A group of volunteers formed Drag the Red, taking matters into their own hands when they felt authorities weren't doing enough. Armed with homemade dragging equipment, boats, and unwavering resolve, they searched the river's depths for evidence, for closure, for the truth that lies just beneath the surface. This is the true story of the Red River missing, a tale of tragedy, systemic challenges, and a community's relentless pursuit of justice. This is Northern Crimes. The Red River winds through Winnipeg like an ancient serpent. Its waters stain the color of rust from the clay that lines its banks. But for many Indigenous families, the river's reddish hue carries a more haunting symbolism, the blood of their missing loved ones. It was one of those endless summer days in August 2014 when Detective John O'Donovan's phone rang. The Winnipeg homicide detective had just finished Sunday lunch with his family when his duty inspector called with news that would change everything. A body had been found in the Red River, weighted down in a bag. Within hours, O'Donovan was at his desk, coordinating officers and handing out assignments. The body was in such an advanced state of decomposition that it took 4 hours to determine it was that of a young woman. The river had done considerable damage, making identification difficult. Eventually, a tattoo of angel wings on the young girl's back led officers to identify her as Tina Fontaine, a 15-year-old who'd been reported missing. Within days, Tina's case made headlines throughout Canada, not just for the horrific nature of her death, but for what she came to represent. The latest victim in a seemingly endless pattern of violence against Indigenous women. Tina's story began far from the murky waters where her life ended. She grew up on Saging First Nation, about an hour's drive north of Winnipeg, where she was raised by her great-aunt Thelma Favel. Like hundreds of other reserves across Canada, Saging existed separated from mainstream society, largely self-governed. Before tragedy struck, Tina had been a vibrant, caring girl. She took children who were bullied under her wing and was surrounded by friends who adored her. The walls of Thelma's home were covered with evidence of Tina's life, pictures of her as a grinning infant, photos with friends, and tributes from classmates who spoke of her warm, joyful smile. But Tina's world shattered when her father was murdered in a drunken bar fight. Asked to write a victim impact statement for the court, she struggled to find the words. She would start, then crumple the paper, unable to express her grief, and it was during this time that Thelma noticed Tina beginning to drift away. As Tina sought connection elsewhere, she began talking more to her biological mother. She asked Thelma if she could visit her mom in Winnipeg, And because Tina had done well at school, Thelma agreed, giving her money and a phone card with instructions to call if she needed help. It was the last time Thelma would see Tina alive. What happened to Tina in the week she spent in Winnipeg remains partially shrouded in mystery. Fragments of her final days emerged through text messages and witness accounts. She sent photos to her sister showing bruises, claiming she'd been abused and beaten. Other messages showed her using drugs, a troubling sign of a downward spiral. The system that could have protected Tina failed her repeatedly. One night, police officers stopped her in a car with an older man. Despite being listed as missing, they let her go, a critical mistake that would later become the subject of an internal investigation. Hours after this encounter, Tina was found unconscious in a back alley. She was taken into the care of Winnipeg's Child and Family Services, but she ran away. Her last communication was a text to her sister meant for Thelma and her husband. She loved and missed them, but wasn't ready to come home. Days later, Tina's body was discovered in the Red River, wrapped in plastic and weighted down with rocks. She'd become another statistic in Canada's crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Back at her home, Thelma kept waiting for a call that would never come. The phone card she'd given Tina remained unused, a painful reminder of a life cut short. Tina's death came amid a disturbing pattern. Between 1980 and 2012, nearly 1,200 Indigenous women and girls were murdered or went missing across Canada, according to official reports. With Indigenous peoples making up less than 5% of Canada's population, this figure was staggeringly disproportionate. Indigenous women were 4 times more likely to be murdered or go missing than other Canadian women. Many believed these numbers were incomplete, with the actual count potentially much higher. Winnipeg, with the largest Indigenous population of any Canadian city, sat at the epicenter of this crisis. Just months after Tina's body was discovered, another Indigenous teenager, 16-year-old Rennell Harper, was found half naked and unconscious on the banks of the Assiniboine River, just before the point where it converged with the Red River. Unlike Tina, Rennella survived her attack. The temperatures had been dangerously low that night, minus 27 degrees Fahrenheit, and paradoxically, the cold that nearly killed her also preserved her life by slowing down her metabolism. Harper had been out with friends when 2 young men lured her to an isolated spot under a bridge. After attacking her both physically and sexually, they left her in the river. When she managed to crawl back to the bank, the men attacked her again, this time leaving her for dead. These 2 vicious attacks on teenage girls brought the issue of violence against Indigenous women into sharp focus. Canada could no longer ignore that it had a problem. In the wake of Tina's death, something remarkable happened. The grief that engulfed Winnipeg's Indigenous community transformed into action. A group called Drag the Red formed, determined to search the river for evidence that police might have missed. Bernadette Smith became one of the group's leaders. She knew the pain of having a missing loved one. Her half-sister, Claudette Osborne, had disappeared in July 2008. For years, Bernadette had lived with the agony of not knowing what happened to Claudette. Now, she channeled that pain into helping others. Kyle Kematch joined her in leading the group. His sister, Amber, had gone missing in 2010. Together, they organized volunteers to search the Red River, believing that if authorities wouldn't thoroughly investigate, they would do it themselves. The method was simple but grueling. Volunteers went out on boats almost daily, dragging the river with homemade equipment, metal bars with hooks attached to ropes. They'd throw the hooks into the murky waters, hoping to snag something, anything that might provide answers. Drag the Red quickly grew from a dozen friends with a borrowed boat to an organization with more than 3,000 members on Facebook and 60 regular volunteers who searched the river after work and on weekends. The work was difficult and often disheartening. Most times, the hooks brought up junk, sticks, weeds, or garbage discarded in the water. But occasionally, they found items that raised questions: clothing, personal belongings, and bones. When bones were discovered, Dr. Emily Holland, a forensic anthropologist who volunteered her expertise, would examine photos to determine whether they were human or animal. She recognized the importance of the search, not just for potential evidence, but for the healing it brought to families of the missing. The relationship between Drag the Red and local law enforcement was and still is complicated. Police officials acknowledged the group's dedication, but maintained that searching the river was like looking for a needle in a haystack. The department had side-scanning sonar technology, but in the dark, muddy waters of the Red River, even this advanced equipment had limitations. What troubled the volunteers most was that community members had begun sending tips directly to Drag the Red instead of to the police, suggesting a profound lack of trust in official channels. Many Indigenous people felt that authorities didn't take their missing loved ones seriously, that they were viewed as disposable. The roots of this crisis run deep. Tina Fontaine, who spent years studying violence against Indigenous women, points to Canada's colonial history and the systemic dismantling of Indigenous cultures. Government policies like the residential school system, which forcibly removed Indigenous children from their families for more than a century, had a huge part in creating generational trauma that continues to reverberate through communities. These schools tore apart the fabric of Indigenous families. Parents who grew up in residential schools often struggled to raise their own children, having never experienced proper parenting themselves. The cycle of trauma continued, leaving many Indigenous youth vulnerable. Tina's own story reflected these broader patterns. Her father had been raised by his aunt when his mother couldn't cope. Then he'd brought his own children to his aunt when their mother, a sex worker in Winnipeg, struggled to care for them. The intergenerational impacts of colonial policies had shaped Tina's life long before her death. In January 2016, the Canadian government announced a shocking revision to their statistics. The number of missing or murdered Indigenous women in Canada since 1980 might be as high as 4,000, far more than previous estimates of 1,200. Tina Fontaine's death became a turning point. Her name was invoked in calls for action, in protests, and in demands for a national inquiry. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, responding to mounting pressure, launched an investigation into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Although awareness, education, and more resources have become available, the problems still exist. Meanwhile, Drag the Red continues its work. During searches, volunteers have pulled loaded rifles from the river, buckets of cement tied to ropes, blood-stained clothing, and personal effects that might have belonged to missing persons. Volunteers come from all backgrounds: Indigenous community members searching for their own loved ones, allies who recognize the importance of the cause, and those who simply want to help bring closure to grieving families. When the sun sets over the Red River, volunteers tie orange plastic ribbons to branches along the shore. It marks where they've left off, a signal to other searchers where to begin next time. This simple act embodies the spirit of Drag the Red, persistent, methodical, refusing to give up. The Red River continues to flow, carrying its secrets northward. But the volunteers are determined that those secrets won't remain hidden forever. For the families of Tina Fontaine, Claudette Osborne, and countless others, the search for truth continues, one hook, one drag, one day at a time. In December 2015, Raymond Cormier was charged with second-degree murder in Tina's case. However, no forensic evidence or eyewitnesses could directly link him to her death, and the cause of her death was never established. He was acquitted by a jury in February 2018, leaving Tina's family without closure and justice. Tina was buried on Saging First Nation next to her father. Her case helped prompt the Canadian government to commit to creating an independent national inquiry into the issue of murders and violence against Indigenous women, which started in 2017. But for many in Winnipeg, justice remains elusive. The Red River keeps its secrets, and the volunteers of Drag the Red keep searching, refusing to let the missing be forgotten.